So before we go into the presentation, I want to give a little introduction for us. I'm Laney Knowlton. This is Brian Martin. We're business partners. We have a private practice in Highland Village. We have an office in South Lake too. We both specialize in problematic sexual behaviors, sex and love addiction. We're trade partners. We're both CSATs and CPTPs and CCPS, which is the APSAT certification. And Brian is also a polygrapher, hence the reason that we are focusing on this topic today. So.
Thank you. All right, how do we advance this? I know nothing.
I can do that part.
All right.
Or I can't. Never mind.
Show some demo.
Next. There.
I hope we're better therapists. All right, so as a trained polygrapher, we cannot tell you everything there is to know about polygraphs and sending your clients to have a polygraph. There are certain things that do have to remain trade secrets, if you will. It's for your it is also for your protection as well as mine. If you knew everything, it could prevent you from benefiting from a polygraph if you ever have to take one. And I've actually had that happen to somebody who it was a very unfortunate situation. So, so we're gonna start with the basics. What is a polygraph? It's an instrument that measures a person's physiological responses when they respond to a question. And that's a legal definition. It's going to operate on the fear of detection of deception. If they are concerned about the consequences, they will respond. There's always the outliers, people that don't. Even if we give words that sound like always, never, it's most of the time. Let's see, the next one tracks behavioral and physiological responses to stress, such as breathing, blood pressure, perspiration, heart rate, galvanic skin response, which is also part of perspiration. Behaviorally, what it will track, especially is countermeasures. And a lot of people have heard the old adage about, putting a thumbtack in your shoe, and when the question gets asked, you push down on your shoe and you get a response. Modern polygraph detects that very easily. There are a lot of countermeasures over the years that have been developed. Most of them are now thwarted. I don't want to say every one of them, but most of them are. The physiological response, again, that is based on the perception of the detection of deception. If the person, the polygraph subject, is concerned that their deception is going to be detected and there is going to be a consequence to them for it, that's actually a good thing. That's how it gets read. If they are there, and we're going to get into this in another slide, but if they're there and they're going to tell the truth, a little anxiety is a good thing. The last thing, it's important to remember, polygraph measures honesty. It doesn't exactly measure truth. It's their intent to be honest or their intent to deceive. Specifically, their intent to deceive. Truth is a different construct. And we'll try and get into that a little bit later.
1 minute. Sorry.
So what is polygraph not? It is not a revealer of absolute truth. If the person believes a statement and they affirm that on the polygraph, they'll pass. I've had a number of clients who will not remember important things, and that gets caught. When they don't remember unimportant things, they believe their initial statement to be true. Let's say they've had 5 affair partners. One of them was a really long time ago, and they legitimately didn't remember that because the other 4 were much more recent, and they do their disclosure on that. And then they remember the 5th. They could have passed that had the answer been, have you been honest? Had the question been, have you been honest? So it will reveal their belief and their honesty or lack thereof. It is not. It is not a predictor of future behavior. You know, is he telling the truth when he promises to never cheat on me again? Yeah, it's not going to work. It will not predict that. And more importantly, and this comes up a lot, it is not a measure of love. Does he really love me? Did he love her when he was cheating on me? They're legitimate questions that partners ask. They all want to know that. They're all different forms of, am I safe? That's what they want to know. And so, Laney will get into this a little bit later, but being able to translate that, their desire to know, did he love her, into safety and passing that along to the polygrapher is a really important element that a clinician needs to know. So, how accurate are polygraphs? This is always up for debate. So whatever numbers that we can put up here, somebody can show numbers higher and lower. We went with kind of the average and with good sourcing. So the accuracy depends on the examiner's expertise, training, ability, and I think also general funded knowledge. Event-specific single-issue polygraphs, they have the highest rate of accuracy at 89%, because when you start asking more than one question, they get a little gray between them. We don't have time to get into all of that, but just understand the more questions, generally the less accuracy you're going to get. Polygraphs exploring multiple issues have an accuracy rate of 85 in general. When you blend it, you get 87. And again, that really, really does depend on the examiner's ability and the ability to put together questions, the ability to read their instrument properly, their ability to call a truth or call a indication of deception. There are different formats for polygraph. There are different schools of training and thought and methodology. And when you blend all that together, this is about the range of numbers that you get. So I can tell you from personal experience, I used to do at my former agency that I ran, we would do sex offender polygraphs, and we were in the high 90s when we factored in the as later verified, which is when they'll say one answer and it won't seem right to us, and we'll be able to investigate and we can find out whether they were telling the truth or not. So we got pretty high with that. All right. Fidelity versus forensic. Generally, a fidelity polygraph is relational. The goal is to show that the subject has told the truth as they believe it. They were honest, right? It indicates that they were honest, or determine if they are deliberately hiding or lying. And again, this has to do with the questioning. The questioning, and we'll get into it on another slide a little bit more, but the questioning is very foundational, because if they're asked questions about, you know, what they did in very broad terms, you know, did you cheat on me? That's not a polygraph question. It is a question a partner wants to know. It's a very valid partner question. It's not a polygraph question. When you were in Vegas, did you sleep with, you know, anyone? That's not a very general, that's too general. It's not specific enough. You know, we would ask, you know, did a part of you touch a part of someone else? Yeah. Now you're getting to a good polygraph question, but that's relational. Criminal, it's very basic, catch them in a lie. And the goal for criminal beyond catching in the lie is public safety. The bar is a lot lower for that because of the consequence. The consequence for criminal polygraph includes public safety. And that's a different format that we're not focusing on today. We're focusing, like I said, primarily on the relational and the fidelity. Okay, Fidelity Polygraph. It measures physical response, sexual fidelity, not love. Physical responses, like we talked about earlier, they do come through in heart rate, blood pressure, skin response, breathing. You'll notice a lot of clients, when they come back from it, they're surprised at the amount of telemetry that comes off, and their inability, especially the ones we're trying to lie, their inability to control it. And especially with a trained polygrapher, the polygrapher's ability to, in essence, see beyond what the client's trying to project. And it's not, polygraph isn't determined on visual, it is strictly on the data that the client is providing. The client is telling the polygrapher if they're telling the truth. And as clinicians, when you're sending your clients for them, it is important to remind them that they will tell them themselves. They'll rat themselves out. You don't want to set it up to where it is them against the polygrapher. That's how they will frame it in their own mind. But they're gonna speak their own truth one way or the other. They're gonna do it verbally, or they're gonna do it physiologically. And their physiology is the part that they can't control. They will, 90% of them, as soon as they hear polygraph, they're gonna go home and they're gonna Google how to defeat a polygraph. Well, that's funny because polygraphers go, how to defeat a polygraph too, and so everybody has access to the same stuff. I've had clients that have done all kinds of crazy things to try and use countermeasures. That's what we call them, countermeasures against their own body, speaking their own truth. And most of the time, it does not work. For various reasons, not the least of which is they don't practice. But they will do anything to hide. And as a clinician, remember that they protect what's important to them, and their secrets are very important to them, and they will fight to defend them. They have their own reasons. You can work with them on what those are, but they will fight to defend them in the face of everything. And that's okay. The polygraph is likely going to catch them. And then it's just time to deal with the fallout, the relational fallout of that. Again, it does not measure love. A lot of guys that I have sent are always afraid of that question. Are they going to ask if I loved her? And I always say the answer be. And we'll deal with that. When I'm in the role of a therapist, I don't worry about the polygraph side of it near as much. I want to know what their perception is. What is a consequence to them? What does a pass really mean to them? What does deception mean to them? You don't want to get too much into that beforehand because you don't want to undermine the polygraph. But over time, those are really important elements to discuss because it really does give you a window into their general thinking. Because especially when they're taking it seriously, they're starting to get faced with their lies. I've had, well, especially when we did offender polygraph, but even with addict polygraph, when they know the polygraph is coming, week to 10 days prior, I would usually get a phone call saying, "Oh, Brian, I got something I got to tell you. Time to get honest," because they know they're going to get caught. and they, you know, want to be honest now that it's about to hit the fan. So, all right, let's go next. Let's see, can you use a forensic polygrapher to perform a Fidelity Polygraph? In short, yes. You know, I am one. If they're properly trained in both formats, they have to understand there is a difference between the two. You know, for those of you that are CSATs, we get trained from the beginning. Offenders and addicts are totally separate. Yeah, every once in a while there's a little bit of overlap, but we always view them as separate. The same is true for polygraph. If you understand the difference between the two, what you're looking for, how to formulate the questions. Another piece that's important to remember, especially relevant to this slide, is the most effective part of the polygraph examination is the interview. And if it's hard to describe until you've actually seen one done, but when the interviewer, the polygrapher, is really, really good at getting to the core, to the issue, to the deception, most of the time, the polygraph's over before it began. And it's just confirmation at that point. I've done interviews that go 3 hours and then they're hooked up 10 minutes and it's over. And they think it's going to be the reverse. I don't disabuse clients of that too much beforehand. You know, a lot of them remember, you know, some Law and Order episode that they saw where the guy's hooked up and there's all kinds of crazy questions with multiple word answers. And okay, if that's what you think is coming, that's not it. It is quick. The interview is the most important part. Forensics has to do obviously with the criminal side, and that's different than the fidelity side, largely because of the consequence to society and the consequence to the subject. They both sound horrible, but you know, life in prison versus divorce, you know, I think I'd take divorce. But so the stakes are higher, and so the questioning has to be different. You wouldn't want a solely forensically trained polygrapher to do a fidelity test. The guy would leave crying. It would be horrible. So you can't use the same techniques. That said, sometimes we have to put screws to them a little bit, but not that bad. All right.
Do we have any questions before we start talking about how to use them as part of disclosures? Any questions in the chat? Any questions here?
Coming up.
I have a question. I'm sorry. Go ahead. No. I had a question about how an interview can be 10 minutes or 3 hours.
Well, the interview, some states have different rules about all these, but the interview is going to be at least an hour. But the actual, once they're hooked up and doing the polygraph takes about 8 minutes, maybe 10, depending on question length and a couple of other things that can happen. They don't run hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. They're pretty quick once you get down to it. The largest consumer of time is the interview. And that can, you know, like I said, that can go 3-4 hours. I don't want them to go that long.
Are you gonna get into how you make decisions about what to ask during the interview?
No. I'm going to talk about question formulation a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get too far into the interview secret sauce, but how to formulate questions.
I'm talking from a partner perspective. Is
Right.
Really where I'm talking.
Right, and that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
From a clinician's perspective,
Yeah.
how do you prepare the client for the questions?
Right.
Right? To tell them, you know, what's the one thing you want to know? I want to know if you love her. Okay, we can't answer that one.
Right.
But what's the essence? What do we really want to know here? And we'll get to that a little bit later, but the
Okay.
short version is send the outline of what you want to know to the polygrapher and let them do what they do.
Yeah.
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 So,
I was just gonna ask the difference in truth and honesty, but I think you gave it. Honesty is they think they're telling the truth.
Yeah, yeah. If I think that I probably drove the speed limit here. I think I did, actually. I think I did.
There was a lot of traffic. It slowed you down.
And you polygraphed me on that. Did you do the speed limit? And that'd be a terrible question, but let's just say. Did you do the speed limit? Yeah. Okay. I'm being honest with you. I believe I did. Now, if somebody comes along with a radar detector and said, 75, and it was a 65, I didn't know. And that's important to know, because when guys are doing their disclosure, preparing it, there's a lot of pressure. They don't remember everything, especially if they're a little older. Things happened when they were younger, you know, they don't remember everything.
COVID.
Yeah, COVID. So what I do is I say, look, if you are honest and you say, you know, I told you it happened 4 times, but now I forgot there was this one thing, it was 20 years ago, so it happened 5 times. Same event, not a huge difference, obviously something that she wants to know, very important, not intentional, not really consequential. Okay, that gets handled one way. You say, oh, I forgot, I have a second family in Kenosha. Forgot to put that one down. That's different. So it has to do with a lot of context, right? And that's from a clinical standpoint, those are things that you need to know in terms of limitations of the polygraph, that he's not always lying. If he says, when all the smoke clears, you know, within 30 days of giving it, you know, he's finally, his anxiety is coming down, hers is coming down, there's a little bit of relational healing, and then boom, oh, yeah, it was 5, not 4. Then it gets handled. So, okay, good question.
Any questions on the chat? Okay.
Please.
Oh, good.
I just did real quick, what impact or effect would someone who has severe, lifelong toxic shame, not guilt, shame? Because I mean, like, sometimes that can affect like all kinds of things, blood pressure and respiration and everything. Just to say hello, and it scared me. It used to, you know, it scared somebody to death. I mean, I did years ago. This is back in President Carter, I think. Like we had somebody do a class, and one of the questions they asked me was, "Did I have blue eyes?" And it said I was being deceptive when I said yes. And so I just wondered what my toxic shame was worse back then. Been working on it ever since. But anyway, I just wondered if that has any effect. You know,
Question, yeah.
in honesty.
So can I recover the question, because I don't think people heard it online? Basically, does toxic shame
Yeah.
affect polygraph results?
That's a common, the questions of will something affect it? A lot of people, and I'm not equating the two, a lot of people will say, you know, well, can a psychopath take one, right?
Yeah.
Again, I'm not equating the two, it's just one of the many questions. The general answer is yes. There are always exceptions. There are other precautions and other things that we might recommend as polygraphers to help get a more accurate assessment. But the short answer is probably. Good question. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not reading this one. I can't see it.
So we're going to talk a little bit about where to use a polygraph in a professional disclosure. Basically, you have 2 options. You can use it before they read the disclosure, or you can use it after they read the disclosure. Those are your choices. So there are benefits and pros and cons to each. If you do it before they read the disclosure, which from what I have heard from talking to polygraphers is more common in the North versus in the South. I have no idea why that is. In Texas. So if you do it beforehand, you do have the ability to be able to say, this information is accurate to the very best of our ability. It our ability to be able to determine there isn't anything that's being left out that they are aware of, that they're deliberately withholding from the information. Doesn't mean that there isn't something that might come up later, doesn't mean there might not be little details, but they are not deliberately trying to withhold information. Additionally, anything that comes out as part of the polygraph can be included in the initial disclosure. And when we're talking about disclosure, I'm referring to disclosure of infidelity. However you translate that, could also be a financial betrayal, but you're disclosing betrayal. So are you including all the information on it? Were you honest to the best of your ability, to the best of your memory? Are you withholding something? Not that those would be the polygraph questions. Those are the general topics that we are covering as a result of it. The cons to that would be that you don't, as the partner does not get a chance to review the document beforehand. So the part which is appropriate, you shouldn't have them read it beforehand before it's presented. All sorts of reasons behind that. Not talking about disclosures today, so I won't cover those. But in general, the partner doesn't get the chance to review it, and therefore, no matter how good of a therapist you are, no matter how well you know your client, you're not going to know every single thing that they're going to question. I've had disclosures where we thought it was complete, and then the partner, it was presented to the partner's like, wait a minute, what about that year? Or what about that trip to New Orleans? Or what about this? I had no idea. So if you do it before, then you don't have the chance to include specific questions by the partner. You don't want to, really want to avoid trying to do multiple polygraphs on the same information, or even multiple polygraphs around the disclosure process. You don't want to do one before and one after. It can decrease the accuracy of it. It's just not a great idea to do multiple ones. So if you do it before, you do have the information on there, you don't have a chance to have the partner ask specific questions. If you do it after, it still can verify that the information on there was presented as accurately as possible, that it was honest, not necessarily true because stuff may come up later, but honest, they're not withholding information. Additionally, it gives the partner the chance to include questions around it. One of the problems with that is anything that comes up as part of the polygraph, or if somebody was withholding information, you don't know it till after the disclosure has been read. The way that we do our disclosures, we do it afterwards, and then we set up another session for about a week later where the polygraph results are presented. So that's what we've decided to do. That's the model that we use. There are pros and cons to both, and that's how we handle that one. Anything you want to add on that?
Okay. So we're going to go back to different types of fidelity polygraphs. The classic one is 3 to 5 questions, includes general confirmation of truth, honesty in the disclosure. The questions are formulated by the polygrapher. This is one of the more common ones. When you just send your client for a regular polygraph, this is what they're going to get. You can send some topics. We want to know, we have questions about fidelity, we have sexual fidelity, financial responsibility, fidelity, and employment, right? So if you just send topics to the polygrapher, they, it's kind of a shotgun. You never know, shotgun approach. You never know, it's not going to be very specific, but at least there'll be some areas. An in-depth disclosure polygraph, and different polygraphers use different names for them, but so when you call it, just say, will you do a polygraph around a full disclosure? It will include the review of a disclosure letter. So you'll want to have that prepared early enough that it can get to the polygrapher early enough that they can read it and start formulating their questions even before they meet with the client. What I try not to do is have the disclosure and the client in front of me for the first time at the same time. It's very hard to process all of that, especially when you have somebody sitting in front of you who's nervous and probably chatty Cathy, and it's very distracting. So pre-polygraph questionnaire, a lot of polygraphers will ask that the subject will fill out a long questionnaire. I've seen these 20 questions, I've seen them 100 questions. I go back and forth on which format I like better. Generally, the more information, the better in terms of relational recovery later on. So if that's the long-term goal, then probably want to act accordingly. I will say that you should be prepared. It's often very triggering for the partner to see that questionnaire. They always want to see it. If everybody agrees, then they should see that. But just be prepared. It's even the questions where most of them will be answered no. They can be very triggering at a very vulnerable time. So there'll be questions about sex with an animal, and that can be like, oh my God, who gets asked this? Who says yet? They get very distracted, and it's very triggering. So you definitely want to be prepared for that. You want to add something?
With my partners, if they want to review the pre-disclosure questions, not the disclosure itself, I have them do it in an office with me, so I can go over all of the triggers that come up as they read through it.
Yeah.
So that is the only place that, and I tell them, don't go read the booklet that we're having your partner use for the disclosure.
Yeah.
You can review anything you want in here. I'm not trying to hide it from you. I don't want you to have this dumped on you without support like you have had done in the past. I don't want to repeat your trauma. I'm not trying to hide it from you, but I want you to have support as you read it. So I'm not hiding it from you. I'm making sure you have support.
Multiple partner questions. We do encourage the partner to come up with their own specific questions that will obviously get added into the disclosure, but also get added into the polygraph. They will not, those questions, if partner sends 10 questions, not every one of those specific questions is going to be asked. And it's important to manage their expectations that way. Every polygraphers handle it differently. Sometimes they'll get the questions, get a set of answers to it, and then say, are these answers accurate? There's a little bit less reliability, but it's one way to get a sense of the fidelity that you're asking for. But again, that is a limitation of it, because we're not going to ask 10 or 20 questions on a polygraph. That's not how it works. Truthfulness on all, but not each question. Okay, and we'll get into this a little bit later. The in-depth one, when you have multiple questions, you might get, let's say you have a 3-question test, you might get truth on 2 and an indication of deception on 1. That's going to be a failed test. It's all or nothing. So you do want to, if the polygrapher, some polygraphers do this, some don't, you get to see the exact questions that were asked, the exact relevance. And so you do want to have an opportunity, if you can, to assess those questions and see if they were asked exactly accurately. And that's really important, because there's so much on the line that if the question was not asked as intended, that may not be the fault of the polygrapher. There may be just some twist that they don't know about. So you do want to be able to go over that and explain to the partner, if possible, explain where the fail came from. These 2 were on, in my scenario, these 2 were honest, and this one did come back as deception indicated. So we need to go over what that really means. And I'll go over them with my client. I will want, if I'm working with the addict, I will definitely want to know what that's about. Now, sometimes I know when I've done polygraph in the past, get to the end of the test and the guy will say, "Did I pass?" And my response is, "Well, you tell me, and they do. They know what it is, and if they fail, they cough up the truth right there. That happens way more times than not. They'll look at you and go, "Well, I had to try." Okay, well, now you have a failed test, so now you got a big problem. So if you're sending somebody, it really is important that they tell the truth, because there are other things that are damaging to a relationship, but when you're trying to rebuild trust, a failed polygraph is very damaging. It sets them back a long ways. So, okay.
So let's talk about what betrayed partner should ask. First of all, it's not a should as in you shouldn't want to know this. It's not a should as in we're trying to limit the information. We're not trying to keep things from you. We're actually trying to reveal truth. That's the whole progress. That's the whole reason we do disclosure. But the questions on a polygraph, again, they cannot be things like, did you really love me? How could you have gone and done that and then come home and told me that you loved me? Why did you pay for it this time and not pay for it this time? Those are all process questions. They are not yes or no questions. They cannot be polygraphed. You can't, like, there's no way you can ask the question, like, why did you pay for it this time and not pay for it this time? Have them process the answer and then say, were you honest in what you shared? Like, so that's the second part, ask for verification of information given. You can ask yes or no questions. And again, like Brian said, you send, this is what I want the information on to the polygrapher. They know how to be able to formulate the question for you so that you'll maximize the chance that you're going to get the information that you want, verification of it. But it would be yes or no questions. So it would be, did you pay for sex that time? Did you purchase the service of a sex worker while you were on this trip? Or however they end up phrasing it, but it's, this is the information that I want, yes or no questions. Verification would be, have you had any contact with your affair partner since the last reported contact on March 7th or whatever it is? So that again is a yes or no question, but it's a verification of information that you were already given. You're not saying, why did you not contact them since March 7th? You're not saying, how many times did you contact them before then? You're asking yes or no questions. The number of questions that are allowed, it depends on the polygraph. Yeah.
Yes, no, questions that can easily be answered in yes or no have much higher reliability. If you have a question, a more process-oriented question, and you get an answer to it, and then the polygraph is on, is this an honest answer or not? That reliability goes down a bit. So it's important to remember, if you can at all get down to handing the polygrapher a yes, no, that is the best way to do it.
And polygraph is just one part of being able to determine truth and rebuild trust in a relationship. It absolutely is a tool that is super helpful. That there are a lot of other tools that can be incorporated into the disclosure process that help to rebuild trust, openness, lack of defensiveness, all sorts of stuff that we can. This is just about polygraphs, but there are ways to be able to build trust around things that are not polygraphable. Is that even a word? Anyway.
I think you really love is a yes or no question. It says you can't ask that one.
Because that depends on the definition of love. So that's why you can't ask, do you really love me?
Okay.
So you cannot ask, that's a good point. You cannot ask subjective yes or no questions. They have to be more factual yes or no questions. Thank you for pointing that out. The number of allowed questions to spend depends on the polygraphers. We've worked with polygraphers where they said, like, just give me this and I'll formulate 3 to 5 questions. And you can pay if you want 3, and you can pay if you want 4, and you can pay if you want 5, different figure. There are other polygraphers that we've worked with where they say, send me a list of the questions you want answered and write in the questions and I'll have a conversation about it. That's part of the interview. So when Brian's saying interview, it's a conversation with the polygrapher before they get hooked up to the machine. Versus the polygraph is when you are actually, I'm sorry, not machine, instrument. It's instrument. We had this discussion today. I put machine in the PowerPoint and Brian's like, no. So when they're hooked up to the instrument, that's the polygraph is when they're actually hooked up and their responses are being measured. But the interview is when the polygrapher is talking to them beforehand. Don't discuss your questions with the betrayer. Don't discuss your questions with the betrayer's therapist. The reason for that is because if you discuss them with the betrayer's therapist or with the betrayer, they then have the ability to prep their answers. They have the ability to figure out how to formulate it perfectly so they can phrase it perfectly and it comes across as truthful or honest, but isn't actually truthful. So, and if you give them to the betrayer's therapist, then you don't know if that comes up. Not that I'm saying don't trust the therapist, but I'm saying don't even put them in that situation. Don't put them in a situation where they have to hide from their client what the questions are going to be. Don't put the betrayer in a situation where they know what the questions are beforehand. It can decrease the accuracy of the results. Anything else you'd add to that?
No, I primarily work with addicts, so sometimes the partner's therapist will call and say, hey, if we ask this question, we would bypass it. And I usually say, don't ask me that. I don't know. Right? I don't know. So I would advise don't ask. Don't discuss the questions either way. right? If you work with the partners, don't call them and say, well, you guys passed this. If you work with addicts, don't call the partner and say, well, you know, or the partner's therapist and say, you know, ask this or don't ask that, or let's talk about the questions, or it sets up a really bad dynamic between you and your client. Especially if you work with addicts, because now they think that you're on the other side and, you know, all these things. So you can imagine how bad that gets.
I'd say that's true with partners too,
Oh, yeah.
because they'll think that you sided with the betrayer instead of them.
Because they're all, both of them are in a very vulnerable position. It's intended, polygraph, I don't know if it's intended, but it kind of is, for the subject to feel very run down. They are to be intimidated walking in. That's part of the process, right? Even if I've had guys they swear up and down, they're gonna go tell the truth, and they go in, they tell the truth, and they pass, and they're shocked. I thought it was, oh my God. I thought something was gonna go wrong, you know? And, you know, I have to keep in my mind, you know, okay, well, yeah, you did pass. That's okay, that's normal. But for them, it is this huge, again, a lot of them have Googled polygraph and they've read all the horror stories and all the things that can go wrong. And, you know, a story about how well polygraph works is boring, and it's not gonna make it anywhere. So it's only the horror stories that are gonna make it. So
you'll tell them the betrayer, you know, ahead of time that they are a betrayer before they ever come to you?
Usually they walk into our office because a betrayal has been discovered or revealed. Sometimes I'll walk into our office because they know there's a betrayal that they want to reveal, or they want to process through what to do.
every once in a while you might get, you know, a couple who, well, there's something wrong in our marriage, we just don't know what it is. Well, one of you might, you know. So yeah, in terms of labeling,
Yeah.
maybe they wouldn't be walking in, but at some point. Okay, how to prepare your client. We've alluded to some of this, but I want to make sure that we cover it. Explain the importance of being honest and complete in their disclosure letter. Less is not more in this one. More is more. Give detail. Give detail in that disclosure letter. Allow the polygrapher to review it. The polygrapher, get a consent if possible to talk with the polygrapher, and be able to have that discussion with completeness in mind. It's the details that are either going to help them pass if they're honest. It's going to trip them up if they're not.
With details, we don't mean graphic details.
Right.
We mean clinical details.
Yeah.
We're not talking about describing what you did with the person in step by step by step.
Right.
We're saying, okay, so for example, I have people use clinical language. So it is, was there touching above or below the waist? Was there touching above or below clothing? Was there oral sex? Was there intercourse? Was there anal sex? Like you go through the list of, these are the checklist items, not I put my hand here and then I put my hand here and then they put it, like, no, that's not what Brian's talking about with details.
If they skim $50 a week off paying the babysitter to pay a prostitute, that's a detail that's really important. That's where that money came from. That's somebody who's watching their children, right? That is an important detail. Explain the differences and similarities between outright deception and lies of omission. And this is usually, it's always interesting which guys, which clients, usually guys, want to discuss the finer points of an active lie or a lie of omission. And, you know, you can use your clinical judgment on how to do that. But in essence, one of the things that I'll talk about is if that information was in fact known to whoever you're hiding it from, would it change their perception of you, their willingness to be in a relationship with you, their willingness to trust you, whatever, you know, the relevant issue is, would it change them? In other words, are you doing that overtly or covertly for manipulation? And is that part of their overall clinical pattern of how they behave? So generally they see that, yeah, it's the same thing. So highlight that it is the role of polygrapher to help them pass if they are being honest. That is really, really important. It's also the polygrapher's role to call the indications of deception. And without getting into all the specific indicators on a chart, if you're willing to call it as a polygrapher, if you're willing to call it, you call it, and that's it. And sometimes, depending on which model you're using, you actually don't know which one you're calling until the very end. That's all added up, so that's good. But what's important on that one is the first one. If the person is there being honest, then it is the job of the polygrapher to help them pass, because they're being honest. So you ask, you know, just as good of questions, and you get just as much detail, and you let them, you know, answer everything and be honest and pass. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not, I've worked with polygraphers, I know some of them, and they just want to catch every little thing and they just get so excited when they catch something. And it's like, yeah, that's not, if you're there to read, as a polygrapher, we're just there to read a chart. That's it, right? We're a forensic psychophysiologist, I think is what the title is. You're just there to read a chart. Whatever it says is whatever it says. Whatever the consequences are is whatever the consequences are. And it is their job to administer it and read it properly. And like I said, some remember that, some don't. So try and find one that knows that and remembers that. So do not do an excessive amount of work to decrease their anxiety. Their anxiety can actually help them pass. And I'm not going to get into all the details as to why, but anxiety can be your friend. Yes. And, you know, I mean, you don't want them down there, you know, sweating bullets, shaking, having a heart attack. But if they are prepared to be truthful, it's okay to be anxious. That anxiety is about the unknown, right? If their anxiety is about the consequence, might be an indicator which way that one's going to go. I wouldn't say that to them, but internally I'd be thinking, but they will often come in with their anxiety front and center, and they're going to want you to do something about it. If you're EMDR trained, if you're brain spotting trained, if you're SE, you know, if you're used to grounding your client all the time and doing all those, you know, really important things, sometimes you don't do that. You let them sit in a healthy level of their own anxiety, and you just have to know it's for their own good. So you have to make that call yourself in the moment as to what's right for your client. What to expect and the disclosure. Again, there's different types of polygraph. We're going to go back to this one. It depends on the type of therapeutic polygraph. The client will likely be asked to share their disclosure with their polygrapher. It's important to tell them that pretty early on. If, you know, Laney and I work together a lot, I know that she talks to her clients about polygraph. There are some partner clinicians who don't. And if you know that you are working with another clinician who recommends polygraph, tell your client that up front. They need to know. It will bring up some anxiety, but you don't want to be 6 months in and then say, okay, well, make sure you're honest on that. Oh, it's going to get you on the polygraph, right? Then all of a sudden, you're the enemy. You know, you're part of the conspiracy to hold back from them. So be prepared, know who you're working with, and be prepared to tell them it's coming. And also, hopefully, from this, you'll be able to give them some good information on how to navigate that process, especially if they're going to be honest. The polygrapher will likely spend a period of time walking with the individual first, followed by yes, I'm sorry, I said walking, I said should be talking with them. Then they'll get hooked up to the instrument, not the machine, and performing the actual polygraph with either classic or in-depth. The subject is only hooked up to the polygraph machine for a short amount of time. I don't usually get into the specifics of how much time and the ratio and the interview and all that. That just gives them other stuff to think about, and it's distracting. But when they come back from that, you should know that's what they're going to say. Most of them are like, I was only hooked up for 10 minutes. It's weird. Oh, okay. The clinician working with the client will receive a report detailing the results of the polygraph. In my informed consent, I actually will lay out a release of information for the polygrapher. That when we get closer to it, I'll have them sign it, because that's just standard, and I want them to know that it's coming. There's going to be a polygraph, and I'm going to ask to talk to them. It's that simple. I've had one person who did not want to sign that. They did not want me talking with the polygrapher. We did not work together anymore. I can't do that. So the results may be able to be emailed to the partner's clinician as well. The way Laney and I do it is we ask that the subject sign release for both of us to receive it at the same time in the same email. You don't want to get 2 emails. You damn sure don't want to get them a day apart. You want to get 1 email sent to both of you. And so both find out at the same time. Now, obviously, the subject who's just taken it, they know if they pass. They know before the polygrapher knows. They walk out of there usually knowing what the final call was. Sometimes not, but usually they do. There's also you can use your clinical judgment as to whether or not in advance you have an arrangement between the couple as to whether they will know, whether he will tell her in most cases, whether he passed. Because what you don't want is, well, I'll only tell her if I pass. Well, she can figure that out real quick. We usually advise no, and then they do it anyways. So, okay, well, the results are not usually sent directly to the client or the client's spouse. I don't advocate for that. Now, I don't own those, so I don't get to say one way or the other. I can give my advice, and my advice is no, send it to us, because oftentimes there's a phrase, a line, a sentence, a question, especially in some of the long form disclosures that are just way upsetting to the partner. And if they're home alone, 2 o'clock in the morning, going through all this stuff, ruminating, that's not healthy. So we do try and avoid that. So.
And I have them again, when they send it to me, we review it in a session. And so usually we'll do a co-therapy session for that, but the partners get the information. I just don't want them to get it at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
By themselves. We have about 20 minutes left.
Okay. Let's see, who owns the results? The client owns the product, right? That is the work product that they paid for. It can only be released with their permission, no matter who pays for it. Sometimes. One person will take the test, the other person will pay for it, right? Somebody else will be paying for it. I've had that happen in the past, and then who really owns it? The polygrapher ultimately has responsibility and jurisdiction over all that. It's just in terms of preparing your clients for what to expect. I also put in my
answer that question.
I'm sorry.
If one person pays but the other person's taking the
Yes.
test, who owns that? Is it the person that pays?
No, it's the client who's the customer. Yeah.
Okay.
Information is. It's just like for us.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The client holds the records.
Okay.
It holds the privilege on the record. So every state's a little different on that. So, you know, it's the polygrapher's job to know who owns that, but in general, it's not.
This is protected information.
Not in every state.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of them don't.
Right.
No. One other piece that I think is important for people to remember. As a clinician, you have to decide, you know, is this going in the record, right? If it goes to your client brings it to you, that's one thing. If it gets emailed to you, that's something different. Therefore, is it discoverable? if something else happens, right? If they make an allegation or, there's all kinds of those things. So my point is, decide for yourself and then put in your informed consent, what happens to these? They really should know in advance what happens to these records, right? If it's my client and he gets the polygraph done, say he passes. Oh, let's say he fails. He fails, and the polygrapher sends it to both of us because Laney's seeing the partner. Does that go in the partner's chart or not? That needs to be clearly laid out. If it goes in the partner's chart and she requests her own records, does she get it? If she gets that, because they're in there, does she get the emails that go with it? Right? So that needs to be in your informed consent. What happens to them? So everybody knows in advance, where does all this stuff go? Same with all disclosure documents too. So that's something that a lot of clinicians don't think about is where does all this paperwork go when it hits the fan? So, oh yes, countermeasures.
We have 8 slides.
Okay, good. Oh, good. We're doing good. Countermeasures, and I'm not going to go over every single one. These are just the most common. If you Google, you'll find it pretty easily. I can't share with you the most creative ones, but the pin in the shoe, that's pretty common. I think it does not work. Holding your breath. Technically, it does affect it, but it affects it to the point where most polygraphers call that a fail. That's it. When I detect countermeasures, I don't care what it is, we're done. No refund, no nothing, we're done. Medications that will prevent sweating. There are some that are legitimate, and that's a side effect. There are some people that have, a lot of perspiration, so they have a medication for that. There's ways to handle that. Most polygraphers have their policy on how they handle that. Blood pressure medications are the same way. One of the questions that they might get asked is, have you taken your blood pressure medication properly today? Oh, I'm not supposed to take 3 times my dose? Oh, I didn't know that. When that happens, the test is over. And you probably end up calling an ambulance because that's not going to go well. Altering the timing of the answers. That was more, I can tell you that was more effective in the past, but it's not now. Modern polygraph is all computerized. It is all recorded. The sensitivity measures that will pick up the telemetry are all recorded as part of a computer program. So if it was to be challenged, it could be replicated exactly. That wasn't always the case. You've seen the old-fashioned instruments that have the pen ink that goes up and down, up and down. Well, there's many stories of the polygrapher just taking their pen and just rest it right on that thing, and then boom, there's no response. And that's, I think I might have had it on one of these slides. I'm not stepping on my own toes here, but I think it was 1933. There was a court case that was all discussed, and that's why polygraph is. They say it's not admissible in court. It is if everybody decides to do it, but it can't be compelled by law enforcement for civilians. There are some like federal employees. I think they have to be able. They can be compelled to. So
It's on the inconclusive slide.
oh yeah, okay. We'll get to that again. Okay, the 3 most common results. No deception indicated. That's the one we want, NDI. And again, especially for your partner clients, make sure they understand what that means. No deception was indicated. It is not 100%. And that's very common. I don't know if you're going to get into this. I don't want to step on your toes, but partner clients, they really look forward to this because they think this pain is going to magically go away when there's a pass, on a polygraph, and it doesn't. Nor should it. It's not perfect. All it will say is no deception indicated. Now, some, polygraphers have their big pass stamp they want to put on top of it. It is a pass, right? And some people like to see that big old bold stamp on top, pass, right? Or fail. Fail is deception indicated. And again, if it's, well, we talked earlier, if it's a 3-question exam, maybe 2 of them were NDI and 1 of them was deception indicated. So you really want to read what that says and really understand what exactly did they fail on. And then inconclusive. And inconclusive can be a number of things. It can be part of a deception indicated. It can be part of countermeasures. There's a number of things that can cause inconclusive. When I was trained years ago, they said, you should expect inconclusive. I think it was 2 to 4% of the time. It should be very, very rare. Something's not right. Something's not right. Yeah.
The NDI could also be they admitted to having an affair, that would still be an NDI. It's not necessarily good news if they pass, if they're telling the truth about having an affair, that's still bad news.
You're more right than you may know. It is true, and there's a way to handle that. Because that happens.
Mm-hmm.
In the interview, they'll start to cop to everything. Sometimes they'll admit to too much, and that is also a countermeasure. Yep, did it. Yep, did it. Yep, did it. Yep, did it. The whole thing. Yep, did all of it. That's not being honest. So there are ways to handle exactly that when that comes across. So, okay, what does passing mean? No deception indicated. It means the client is likely not deliberately withholding information. Could they be accidentally, like we talked earlier at the top? Yeah, that happens. 65-year-old guy who's been ripping and running for 45 years. He's not going to remember everything. Just not. And, takes a polygraph, passes, calms down, relationship gets better, you're driving down the road, sees something, goes, oh my God, I forgot that happened 35 years ago. Oh, I better tell her, right? You do also, just from a clinical perspective, you do want to prep your added clients. If you remember something, you tell me first. Don't run home all proud of yourself that you're going to be honest with your wife and everything's going to go well. It's not. So you want to tell them, look, tell me first, and then we'll decide how to deal with that.
Meaning if you remember something after the disclosure,
Right.
not if you remember something in the middle of the polygraph.
Yeah, not there. After the disclosure. Thank you.
Then how do you handle that?
It depends on what they remembered. Yeah. I call Laney, and then she gets it. But we will coordinate, what's the issue? What's the context? How are they doing? How impactful is it? Again, if it was, 5 and not 4, that's one thing. If it was something huge, that's different.
Now, I will also say that whether or not we think it's something huge,
Yeah.
it can be huge to the partner.
Yep.
Sometimes the biggest things to my clients, if I'm talking about partners, have actually felt like they were small things. And sometimes the things that I would have thought were biggest end up actually the partner's like, okay, like it was 5 instead of 4 versus like he brought her a flower that was a red rose, which he gets me for our anniversary every year. Like, so I have stopped judging what's going to be big or not, and we usually do a co-therapy session where there is basically a mini disclosure, but we set up the formula beforehand. We say, going into this is honesty, not truth. There may be things that come up. This is what we will do if something comes up. They will tell their therapist, we will set up a co-therapy session, they will give you the information, you'll have, and it will be revealed to you within a certain period of time.
So we assume it's going to happen, and we prep them for it, and we follow what we said we were going to do. And we basically err on the side of it's going to be big. It's going to be big. And then if it's not, okay, But we set it up as if it is, so that's a great question, thank you. What does failing mean? Except indicated the client is likely deliberately withholding some type of information which may include omission, distortion, half-truths, or blatant lies. And that's the kicker of the half-truth, right? They'll tell part, or they'll hold back part, or when they, and this is more from a polygrapher perspective, when they tell the truth, they'll tell half of it. Like when they get caught and then they cop to it, they tell half or a part, or they shade it. And then that's what gets entered into the report. So you got to be really careful for that. The polygraph only determines if there is deception present, not the type of deception or what is missing, right? If it's not meant for filling in gaps. There are, from a forensic side, there are ways that we can do that I'm not going to get into today. But for fidelity work, it's not about filling in gaps. It's just about make a call. Is there deception indicated or not? Client can pass several questions and fail one or two. So the mixed result is often called a fail. So we've gone over that. Again, inconclusive. When the polygrapher cannot determine if the client is being truthful or deceptive. For forensic work, an inconclusive is often seen as deceptive. Different jurisdictions will handle the remedy and the punishment differently. But for fidelity work, you know, it's just one more strike to the partner. They can't get the safety that they're looking for, and that's the important way, I think, to look at it from our work. Maybe due to faulty questioning, incomplete information, maybe due to anxiety, complete lack of anxiety in the client. They're not concerned about the consequence, and that's problematic also. Maybe due to medications, maybe due to the client continuing to remember details throughout the polygraph, and exhausting the number of allowed attempts. That is something that is one of the countermeasures that they'll try and do, is they'll try and, you know, mess up each one of the runs, and you know, there's a limit to how much that we can do. And you know, then they get to come home and say, well, polygrapher didn't know what the hell they were doing. They burned out, you know, 5 charts on me, couldn't get an answer, and that way they get to blame the polygrapher.
As somebody who is not a polygrapher, a chart or a run is the 10 minutes or the 8 minutes you're hooked up to the instrument, not machine.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe due to confusing or unclear questions. So, in the past, definitely the old polygraph instruments were very susceptible to manipulation. I think we talked about this, which is why the polygraphs were prohibited in the courts in 1933. Current methods make manipulation results very difficult, if it's not impossible. For forensic ones, we will audio and video record them, and they are admissible. Fidelity ones, oftentimes they will audio, sometimes they'll video them. It's not something I recommend that, you know, partners insist on seeing or anything like that. That needs to stay there. But it is there for those that do it. Due to the potential for manipulation in the past, they're still voluntary in criminal courts rather than mandatory. Most states have them as mandatory for sex offenders, and that's where I learned mine. Each state handles polygraphs differently, and they do have different laws around them. So you don't even know every law around them, but you should be familiar. There are regulations around them, and they are different. Some of the states are different, whether they're fidelity or whether they're forensic.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Are there other offenses that polygraphs are mandatory other than sex?
There are, I think in some states there are some. The other types of polygraphs are like reemployment. Those are really common.
No, I meant for an offense.
For
like
offenses,
criminal.
I don't want to say that I know every state has them, but I think some of them may do some child crime other child crime ones.
So it's really focused around children?
I think so.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't want to say I know a lot about
Yeah.
that, but I know most states will do offenders.
So it's not homicide and it's not the biggies. I mean, this is a biggie, but it's not like the obvious.
No.
So
Well,
interesting.
The offenders have it done post adjudication, it's a supervision tool. It's not a
It's
determinant
not a
of
determinant.
guilt or innocence.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for
So that's
clarifying.
an important part.
Yeah,
That's done while they're on parole or probation,
I,
right? So, now, your question is still valid. Do they do murder,
Yeah.
polygraph murderers while they're on probation or parole?
have you killed anybody since last week?
I think so.
Inconclusive.
Well, and that's a tough question, right? That would not be, not pick on it, that would not be a polygraph question.
Because,
Well, what does that really mean?
really?
What does it really mean? Yeah,
You can
Yeah.
murder their spirit.
You could have run
right?
hours.
They were still
Were you
breathing.
present
Yeah,
when Sally died?
yeah, right.
You can say something like that, really narrow, really narrow,
Were you holding the gun that killed Sally when she died?
right? So, apologize to anybody named Sally out there. Can therapists manipulate the results? I mean, the polygrapher. If the client's therapist knows the question, the clinical therapist. If the client's therapist knows the questions prior to the polygraph, they can review them, practice answers, contaminate the results. And that to me borders on the unethical, if not loudly crosses it. But even if it doesn't happen, even if the clinician, the addict's clinician has the questions and doesn't share them, I think that's a different kind of ethical bind that they're in. The partner, if they ever get wind of it, will never be able to trust that process, right? And I think really that's the important way to look at this, is where's the benefit to the partner on this? There's certainly a benefit to the addict, but how is each one of these steps going to be perceived by somebody who's had their trust damaged really, really, really bad?
Which actually benefits the betrayer too.
Yeah.
Because if the partner is able to build trust, and like, let's say I handed the questions to Brian, Brian is a polygrapher, if he had them, and then the partner finds out about it and then questions the process, that then questions the betrayer whether or not the betrayer told the truth, or was honest about it, not told the truth.
Yeah.
But whether or not the betrayer answered the questions to the best of their ability, it will then be brought into question. So it benefits both. It's not just the betrayer.
Yeah, you really want the partner clinician leading it, if you will, with the questions. And even the partner and their therapist will pick the polygrapher. They'll say, hey, we expect it'll be done in the next 30 days or whatever. I had a guy a while back, he knew the polygraph was coming, it was a Fidelity one. And so he decided on his own to go have it done. Magically, it was a pass. And I said, how did you know what questions to ask? Well, she asked me the same questions all the time, so I just had the polygrapher ask me that. Oh, that did not go well. And, I'm not in his heart. I don't know. I suspect he really thought that he was doing the right thing, but it did not come out that way. So.
So is he unfaithful?
Well, he passed,
See,
right? Yeah. And rightly so. I mean, she's really concerned about it, like a little bit. Oh boy, this is really small, right? Use of maintenance polygraphs to rebuild trust. Usually they're scheduled quarterly. Apologize, people on the camera. Then semi-annually, then annually. They do taper down over time. They don't have to be done every quarter. There are some couples that they decide, yeah, we're gonna do it every quarter. It seems to help, right? They know the routine, and it works for them. That's fine. Only includes questions about events and behaviors like countermeasures since the last polygraph, since the last no deception indicated polygraph, right? So the last past one, or new information that has been remembered since the last polygraph. We can also include some specific questions too about that same timeline. Helps to increase emotional safety in relationships, and helps to decrease fear and reactivity in the partner. So Okay.
That's it.
Oh, wow, that was good.
So
All
how much
right.
do they cost?
Everybody's different. You know, you're probably looking at a couple $100.
Okay.
3,
I
4,
didn't know it was
5.
in the thousands, okay. 500.
Oh, I'm sure you can find a polygraph for over 1,000, but
Usually they're 600 to 800-ish.
Okay.
yeah. And again, it depends on the number of questions. It depends on, you know, which one it is. Sometimes a maintenance one is less. So you have to call and find out.
And it also can depend on what you're providing them. We have one polygrapher who gives a discount if you're working with a therapist,
Mhm.
because then you give them an already written and processed disclosure letter. So that's on top of the questions that they ask you.
Yeah.
So it depends.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, please.
Is a marijuana, if someone's does a lot of marijuana, are they harder to detect? Are they the narcissist kind of who believes their lies because they're so numb to all that, whatever that.
So those are two separate questions. They're both a challenge. They're both a challenge. Are they impossible? Probably not. But there's a challenge. So, but those are also in some states, they can be told, you know, you can't be high when you come in. You know, you can't do this, especially on the forensic side, right, on the criminal side.
So one of the questions on chat, you touched on it briefly, but maybe go into some more detail. What is the purpose of the interview? What do you look for and how is it used?
Well, the purpose of the interview, in short, is to clarify the questions, right? Sometimes it's down to the detail of, you know, I'm going to ask you questions about your history of being faithful to your wife. What's your wife's name? So we understand when I say your wife, who are we talking about, right? Because what if it's a second wife? He could have in his head first wife, right? Not all of them play games like that, but it's possible. When we talk about infidelity, what are we talking about? What is and what isn't, right? So we want to understand, what are we talking about? Sometimes a good portion of that time is like Laney said earlier, just going over those disclosure questions, right? So you answered yes to this. Tell me a little more about that, right? You answered no to that. Well, tell me about that. So that just takes time. And some guys are cooperative and they rip right on through it, and some of them start with, well, you know, and they burn a ton of time doing that. Sometimes I'll call that a countermeasure. So. Thanks. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, this is something I struggle with working with people is the, people call it love addiction, and I think it's sexual addiction.
Okay.
Cruising, being addicted to flirting, but not consummating anything.
Okay.
And so then the person, the partner is aware of this and they're more threatened because it sounds like love.
Okay.
And so.
So in the interview, we would talk about an emotional affair, and we would come to an agreement on what an emotional affair is. Presumably the question would talk about something like that, so the polygrapher would know, right? And so there would be a discussion on what's an emotional affair and what is it not. And then, you know, have you done that? I can answer that, right?
I also clearly have partners define what they mean by flirting.
Yeah.
So I have them actually put that in the question, and in my pre-disclosure questionnaire, it lists, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but it's something along the lines of, did you have sexually or romantic charged conversations? Did you exchange emails or letters? It goes through a whole list of this is what it is. So if the partner thinks that there's an emotional affair or wants to ask about that, I actually take that language, put it directly in the question, and that would be sent to the polygrapher.
And, you know, you work with addicts long enough, and you can see there's the ones that they want to find a way to be honest, and then there's the ones that want to find a way to not. Right? It comes through on this too. We don't get to, you know, factor that in. You know, we read the chart. The chart say, okay, that's what you get. So
Not just addicts here.
yeah, that's true. But again, as a clinician, you take, this is a piece of data and you take it in its totality. You take all of it. you gotta help your partner client see it as such. It is a piece of data for them to assess their own level of safety in the relationship. That's what it is. Nothing more, nothing less.
Now, I will also say regarding love addiction, specifically, one of the populations I work with specifically is females dealing with problematic sexual behaviors. Love addiction is much more common in that population than it has been with the males that I have worked with, either with the partners or with the betrayer. When you are working with love addiction, very often the realizations of what actually defines inappropriate interactions will come in layers.
Yeah.
So there will be, at the beginning, they will say, oh yeah, I did flirt with them. And then, you know, maybe even a year down the road, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize this was flirting. I shouldn't have done this. So that very often is just sort of a developmental process of being able to recognize what healthy boundaries are around relational interactions. And so some of that it's not necessarily polygraph stuff, it's more recovery process and being able to identify what healthy connection even looks like and healthy boundaries.
For some of your clients, when you're, would be female also then.
Mine?
So if
Both of us work with clients of all genders and all, I run groups for females who are struggling with problematic sexual behaviors and sex and love addictions. And so we have both. I have my partners groups are also, they include all genders. So I've had.
Person.
Yeah.
Or a woman. A
Yeah.
woman can be the betrayer.
Yeah.
Okay.
What does it look, what's the instrument look like? Does it look like an EKG instrument?
Great question.
What is?
It's about.
It's just a machine.
Giant violin.
It's an instrument, Vita.
Yeah, no, it's,
It's equipment.
well, they're down to about the size of that camera. That doesn't help for the people on the camera, but they're smaller than that. I mean, they're small. There's not much to them.
And what are you looking at? Or it's the.
Oh, then there's a monitor on it too, so
Is it
it's clear
the
for the
computer?
monitor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can see the information coming in.
So it's just like a computer screen.
Yeah. Yeah,
This is very interesting.
okay.
Yeah.
And please email us or call or text us or
Do we want that?
contact us
Yeah.
if you have any questions.
Well, on behalf of Brian and Laney, what a wonderful job. Thank you for helping us understand more about the process as it goes along with disclosure and the usefulness of the polygraph. And again, if y'all have interest in CEUs, if you're at home, please send us an email, info@D2counseling, and we can get that along for you. And then I want to mention that our speaker next month is Andrea Tabor, who is the executive director of the 12-Step Ministry. Most of us are familiar with the little house that sits down at Northwest Highway in Inwood that houses or hosts a multitude of 12-step meetings. And she's the executive director. And her topic will be the 12-step path for families, tolerating discomfort along the path of recovery. And so I'm looking forward to that because that's one of the biggest questions. And I think one of the biggest part of our field is how do families engage the recovery process? It's easy when we can point to the identified patient or the addict or the person in therapy, but it's such a bigger issue than that with the family involved and how can they participate as well. Dina, did you have anything else?
No, just thank you all for attending and for coming tonight
Thanks for
and for
doing
your
that.
questions. Thank you, Laney and Brian.
Drive safe.